This week, we welcome back Mike Nichols, the head of product at Elastic Security, to talk about the MITRE ATT&CK and security visibility looking beyond endpoint data. In our second segment, we welcome back Harry Sverdlov. He's the founder and CTO of Edgewise Networks, and we're going to discuss securing remote access, quarantines, and how it relates to security. In the security news, Palo Alto Networks releases a patch for PanOS, actually several vulnerabilities in its latest announcement. Zerodium, did I say that right? I did. Will no longer acquire certain types of iOS exploits due to a surplus. New Ramsey malware can steal sensitive documents from air-gapped networks. vBulletin fixes a critical patch, so make sure you patch that stuff immediately. U.S. Cyber Command shares more North Korean malware variants and the top 10 most targeted security vulnerabilities. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man who doesn't like URLs in his colon. No, colons in his URL. That's the one. Mr. Paul Astorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode 651, recorded on May 14th, 2020. I'm here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. Everyone else is remote, including Mr. Larry Pesce. Larry, welcome.
Yeah, good to be here. And I busted out this glass for the show tonight.
Nice.
Shall we play a game?
Ooh. It looks empty already, Larry. You need to take care of that.
I just cracked the bottle open, so...
Ooh, what is that? Double oaked bourbon. Sounds yummy.
No idea. Never had it before.
No? Well, you'll have to give us the full review maybe at the end of this segment. Also with us today is Mr. Jeff Mann. Jeff, welcome.
A pleasure to be here as usual, Paul, albeit remotely.
I do have this not the same beer, and just to prove it's not the same beer, I'm going to open it. Yes, open it. And
no, it hasn't even been opened yet. Yeah, I did spot that already.
It is the last one that was in there. I'm going to have to replenish now. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Great to be here. Looking forward to a wonderful show and to starting our next phase of opening here in Idaho. So, fingers crossed.
Also reporting in from Idaho, Mr. Tyler Robinson. Tyler, welcome.
Buenos dias, buenas noches, whichever side you're on.
Outstanding. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. Join the Security Weekly mailing list by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. Click the Join the List button. We'll be rolling out, actually have started rolling out our public Discord channel, so make sure you check the mailing list and our various social media outlets for the invitation. Things are going well. I like hanging out with everyone in our Discord channel, so come join the conversation. Mike Nichols is here with us, no stranger to Security Weekly. Mike leads the product management at Elastic Security. He's the former vice president of product management at Endgame. He manages the product management team and ensures the product team is constantly listening to customers, researching the market, and deriving differentiated technology in order to choose the best strategic path for the company. Did you write that, Mike? That's very marketing-esque of you.
Yeah, do you like it? It was it means it sounds like I do a whole lot when when really I just take credit for all the amazing things the engineers build.
Right. If you want to learn more about the Elastic solutions, visit securityweekly.com/elastic. Mike, as always, nice to have you on the show. Today we wanted to start the conversation by talking about a report that was recently released by MITRE. They did some testing with some specific strains of malware against the MITRE ATT&CK framework and some endpoint solutions. So, Mike, if you could maybe fill us in and set the stage.
Yeah, definitely. And again, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be back here again and talking with you and the team. But I think it's a reoccurring theme. I think every time I come on the show is about sort of boiling through the BS that is the security space and talking a lot about openness and transparency. And I think previous time I was on, we talked about MITRE's testing and how they did their first round of testing last year where they emulated an adversary. They did APT3, Chinese APT last year. And then this year they emulated APT29, a Russian adversary. And I think what's interesting about...
Obviously, Mike, the 29 is way more advanced than the 3, right? There's a lot of versions.
Look, I'm not picking sides in that battle.
Or is it 2.9?
Yeah,
so
right. It could be a point behind.
Yeah, no, it's 26 versions better. I think is maybe
something like
that's
that.
how it goes. But what's interesting about what they're doing is that I think they chose not to score, which is great. Meaning they don't put like a qualitative measure on it. They just provide pure data. So all they've done is basically taken an attack, emulated it, and then just kind of told the world the visibility that's provided with many different products in the test. So the first time around was just a few products, but this time around there was 21 different vendors that participated. And you can go to the website, go to their evals page, and actually look at screenshots. You can get raw JSON data, which we'll talk about sort of how we use that later on. But you can really just dig into the data yourself, which is great because a lot of testing, I'm sure you've seen, is usually you get like the analyst boiled down version of what they think the results mean, not the actual results. And this is just pure open data for you to go make an interpretation on yourself.
That's pretty interesting. I am a fan of not ranking things, right? Because I think that some folks that may measure stuff may put things into like quadrants, and you look for the the dot that's somewhere in the quadrant, and whatever that dot is the best one. Like that's obviously the best product, right? And I think especially in security today, it's not always about which Amazon product has the most ratings and reviews, not which dot you're in the quadrant, right? So I really want to get away from the ranking of saying like this is the best for this and this is the best in this space, because it's different for every organization, right? And everyone has different requirements, everyone has different risk tolerance, different teams, different things to protect.
Yeah, I think risk tolerance and also sort of sophistication or maturity of a security team are both things to consider, right? Because it might be the best product in sort of some rating scheme, but does that mean that your team can actually use it well? And that's why getting your hands onto it is also so important, and sort of eliminating barriers to get teams to actually get their hands on the products and evaluate for themselves is kind of the critical qualitative piece of this whole conversation. But what I like about the visibility side is that at least it opens it kind of demystifies sort of the marketing speak. You go to anybody's, in fact, you can just look at the results, the press releases from the test. Like everybody claims they won. Everybody's website says that they're the best at the thing that they, at this solving all these problems. But now you can look at real quantitative data and say, well, I care about, so for example, APT29, what they did a lot of emulation around was living off the land techniques. So most of it was executed via PowerShell or WMI, or through some obfuscation of those things, whether it's commandlets or script blocks or something, and then said, look, here's the visibility. So if you care about this type of attack, of this living off the land technique targeted at Windows, do these products have the data you need or not to make your own decision? And at least you can, as a buyer or a user, can look and say, okay, well, I won't look at these 6 because they don't meet my needs. I'll go start talking to these other 6, and then you can at least narrow your conversation, because especially in the endpoint space, I mean, every day there's some new endpoint vendor. I think there's like 80 plus that are going to tell you they're going to solve your mission. So there's a starting point here, right? So,
Jeff.
Sorry, at the risk of stealing your thunder, I have an immediate question. If you can, and I'm sure you're going to go into this, but it's bugging me, so I'm going to ask the question anyway. So a bunch of products were evaluated, I guess, based on APT29. That's the gist of this exercise.
That's correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Could you categorize? I mean, I'm looking at it now, and I see a bunch of names of things. Do these products or companies fall into a particular, not a ranking, Paul, but just what are these products designed to do? Do they do one thing? Do they do one of several things? What are the kind of buckets that these vendors that went up against APT29 actually do?
It's a good
Is there a
question.
way to...
The vast majority are in the endpoint sort of protection space, whether you want to call it EDR or EP, whatever the buzzword or marketing term is, because most of the telemetry that was gathered in this test was off of hosts, off of actually end user systems. There was sort of this burgeoning terminology, which I like, this idea of sort of XDR, everything detection response. And there were some people that are more classically kind of growing into that space where they look beyond endpoint. They were also part of this because it's about kind of combining your network data and your host data and your LDAP data and everything else into one kind of collection to correlate and enrich the threat and not just give you sort of alerts with no context. But
so
I
to
think
clarify,
most of the, the vendor list. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So endpoint protection, whatever we're going to call these things, primarily they're detecting the activity first, and then I guess there's varying degrees of response. Is that a fair categorization?
Yeah, in this evaluation, they actually didn't test response or remediation capabilities. What they did do is they had a layer, and if you go to what is it, attackevals.org, MITRE.org, I think is we can give you the site.
Yeah, there are. So I guess I should hang on one second, Mike. So if you go to wiki.securityweekly.com, wow, the Elastic created a dashboard based on the results from MITRE, and that link is in there. And then from that page, you can get to the MITRE page, which is attackevals.mitre.org. And this round is the APT29. So you can see both those links are in the wiki for our listeners' reference. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, okay, so most of this exercise was strictly detection.
Yeah, detection, but there's a little bit. So there's a variance that I liked that what they did, and you can see some of the data in some of the sort of dashboard visuals on the page is they added some categorization to detections. And I think the ones that are most interesting from a analyst perspective is this idea of correlation and sort of telemetry. The idea is, did the alert you gave me either link to other alerts of interest or add additional data and context? And I think that's pretty critical because, anybody could have written for the test and just created, thousands of alerts on anything. But if you don't tie the story together, sort of collect the narrative together, I remember years ago, I'm sure, using things like Super Timeline, right? You throw all this Windows event logs into this Excel doc and build this macro. And, can we do that automatically now for users? Can we eliminate the suck that is the data gathering portion of an analyst job? And I think correlation, telemetry, that really starts to tell that story a little bit. It's not the full story, obviously, but it begins to tell you that this alert actually has more meaning to it. It isn't just a flag of some random event.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, when you look at things like total detections and total misses, you wonder, to what level being focused on just APT29, did some of the vendors focus more on that than others, and that's why they may rank higher in some areas? I don't want to say that any vendor had, knowledge of this type of testing going on at MITRE in the past. Certainly that's happened where, like you said, Mike, vendors just write to the test and, take a piece of malware or craft a piece of malware and then tune their product so they can detect it and show you a demo, which is not very helpful, right? I like to think that this MITRE evaluation happened somewhat behind closed doors. I don't know if you can shed I know you're not representing MITRE, right? But if you could maybe shed some light from your experience from the Elastic side where and how these tests are conducted by MITRE.
Yeah, I think MITRE does a really good job at trying to, like you said, stay true to the nature of the test and avoid bias and those kind of things. They do talk about the attack vector beforehand. So very simple, they just released what round 3 is going to be, which is going to be focused on Fin7. And they at least released the initial architecture, which is some point-of-sale systems, some Linux boxes this time, which is great. So it's adding a different host-based system. And also adding, so of course, some Windows systems as well. So there's some knowledge, and you can do your own research and learn about that. But they do, the positive thing, as you mentioned, compared to other testing, is they don't say here's the exact sample, like go right for it, which provides, I think, an air of confidence to users when they look at this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's more they're looking at techniques that are used by a group, not necessarily the specific malware, within that group. They're testing things we've publicly observed about APT29.
Exactly. It's all, if they're focused, because of the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, they're really heavily focused, and they even highlight the areas in which they've tested on the behavior detections, right? Are you able to detect the technique or tactic that's being utilized, and not there isn't a tooling or a signature based testing in this, which is really useful.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like you said earlier, it's kind of like the gift of doing something like this, but the curse of not scoring is that then it leaves it to broad interpretation. Like as mentioned, every vendor sort of claims that they won for some way they've skewed the data. And that's why, as you mentioned earlier, like what we did, sort of the elastic way to be open, is we took all that raw JSON data and put it into a dashboard that's freely available for anybody to access in our website. And it just lets you figure it out, right? We don't put any weighting on it. It's just the raw information, and you can go in and say, this is what's important to me. I care about, for example, I really care about a specific modifier like MSSP, and I want to go look at how MSSP testing did and add that or change that visual for your own way. So it's more about letting users make their own decisions and just being open about the information.
What were some of the other specific attack techniques that you thought were interesting for whatever reason, specific to vendor or not, that they were able to emulate in this testing?
Yeah, I think what they did well, and what actually I'm excited about that on our side, is that they did a good job of when they emulated the PowerShell attacks. They didn't just run PowerShell. They did a lot of different obfuscation techniques to sort of show what's happening in the real world. And this goes down to the visibility side. I mean, we can go into as much depth as you want, but like, for example, one of the things that we had done last year was look at PowerShell visibility. There's of course AMSI that Microsoft has that provides some visibility, but I think on day 0 it was already bypassed by adversaries. And we found a different approach, right? We actually implemented our own sort of hooking based approach to get data not using AMSI. To be working on older versions, so we can go back to version 5.1, which gives us support on Windows 7, for example, where maybe Microsoft supports only on Windows 10 and above. And I think that helped a lot because we built it because that was what the trend was in the world. And MITRE then did their evaluation on sort of the growing trends, which is a lot of this obfuscation in PowerShell. So I think that was interesting to see that they're following the trends, right? They're testing what is, I think, being utilized more and more across not just APTs. I mean, we say the APT name, but really these are techniques that are being implemented in crimeware groups and other areas as well.
In PowerShell still being a pretty popular technique, I kind of go to Larry and Tyler, or is PowerShell slowly starting to phase out as these products and the defenders basically awareness of PowerShell being used as an attack vector?
I would say PowerShell in general, like a PowerShell.exe or calling like a PowerShell cradle, yeah, that's probably not used as much. Most EDRs will detect that. Most AVs will detect that. Like anybody that's doing any kind of security should be detecting and flagging on that pretty quickly. So when you start talking about like the unmanaged memory space, anything that's .NET or bring your own like interpreter, those are the big pieces that are starting to take hold. So yeah, you're still using some of the PowerShell functionality, some of the core of .NET or that unmanaged space. And so PowerShell is essentially being abused, just not in the way that it traditionally was.
So you're loading PowerShell through other mechanisms, right? Silent Trinity does some of that and other techniques, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in fact, like in particular with that, we chose the implementation we did because we wanted to look for, script blocks, for example, that were doing that. And we also, I think we talked about it a previous time, but we also implemented a technology for command language runtime visibility and prevention, which looks for that sort of .NET reflection that's being built into things like Sharpshooter or Cobalt Strike and others. And just different methods to take these sort of, like you mentioned, core capabilities and run them in other processes, right? Not run them out of the sort of PowerShell.exe. But then there's other stuff too. Like I'm sure you've seen that as more and more EDR technologies are looking at things like the command line, we've seen command line spoofing really rise in an attack technique. And so we've implemented a way to also sort of hook there and monitor the command line throughout execution and actually flag or prevent based on sort of massive changes to that command line, and then tell the user what happened, right? That it was supposed to execute this and it actually executed that, and provide very clear information about what that attack was actually doing under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
And a lot of the techniques are living off the land, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. In the MITRE evaluation, and I think in the things that we focus on in Elastic is a lot of that because, we just aren't seeing as much of this sort of bring your own toolkit, drop a big chunk of tools into the environment as much as we are seeing a rise in trying to utilize living off the land techniques. So WMI is another great one where we had to build a lot of tooling and technology to add visibility and protections around that as well as this another place that people are taking advantage of, like PowerShell.
I also find it interesting, as we look at all the techniques in here in this report, some of what is kind of left out that I think is important in an evaluation is looking at, like, if your EDR did flag on one of these, would you see it? And would you know what to do with it and how to respond to it? Right? And that's a huge part of your evaluation is, how is it buried in false positives? So, I mean, this is addressing really some of the false negative issues, but not necessarily the everyday operations of response, where if you have 10,000 plus Windows systems, are you going to see these events in the real world?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. It's definitely one that we've talked about before with MITRE, this idea of sort of at least showing you the number of alerts that were generated. But I think to their credit, they're very specifically, pushing their test for one reason, which is to show the visibility that a vendor provides, not necessarily to show the next step, which is sort of the actionability. But yeah, I think, you're right. There, you could flag a lot of things and then you get lost in the noise where what's the important thing to look at, right? If everything's the same severity or nothing's prioritized, it really becomes a problem. One of the good things that they do in the evaluation is if you go to each sort of vendor icon, you can actually view the screenshots from each individual detection, which sometimes those screenshots tell a lot, right? They actually show the rule or name that triggered. They'll show more correlated or related things around it, and they might have things like the counts of alerts in the corner, for example. So there's some investigation you can do by just kind of clicking through the different details. If you go to the raw events, or raw, I think it's called raw alerts, and see the different screenshots from those different.
What I also like, now that I dig into this a little more, is they did provide some insights as to the product configuration, which is kind of like where I was going next. Like, yes, you have to be able to respond, basically triage, filter all of the alerts coming from your EDR system, but also it depends on the configuration of these individual systems, largely whether or not it's going to detect a specific technique or not. And MITRE did provide some guidance in there. Is that something, Mike, they came up with on their own, or is it in conjunction with the vendor, or how does that work?
Yeah, that was definitely in collaboration, and I think it's another good one where you want to know if is this the default, or did you make a lot of adjustments that, like you mentioned, could add to a lot of additional noise. Another one that was in collaboration was also calling out the separate piece of an MSSP help versus not, right? So they actually have a separate modifier that allows you to see, how many of these detections were actually helped with or helped by an MSSP, which a lot of times might be an additional add on a contracting side for the customer or the user. So you can really weight the product by itself versus the product with services help, if that's something that you're interested in as a user. I think both of those sort of speak a little bit to the ability for you to adapt and adjust and run that in your own network.
So,
Lee.
question. So I'm looking at the chart you published on your site, and I like the way we can see everybody in there, unlike the one on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which really, almost have to look at one vendor at a time. And it really is a nice comparison. But I'm looking at this and I'm wondering, okay, you saw the results on how Elastic did. Did that give you any ideas of where you needed to focus on for your product, or areas where you were like, well, I didn't know we did that good, or you know what I mean? What kind of insights did you as a company take out of this?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because as Paul mentioned very astutely earlier, this is one particular test of one APT, and it's actually one. It's not even their full capabilities, right? They tested sort of one specific kind of attack vector. So one thing to do is not to over-rotate too much on using this as like, oh, my product's not good, or it is. I mean, people who might not look great here might be great. They might have done a great job at other attacks that are more common, and vice versa. You might look great here, but actually suck at commodity, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I think what was really useful is that MITRE was really communicative during the evaluation. So we got a lot of good feedback from their team during the sort of execution and use that we used for things like ease of use and simplicity. And there were some pieces of the results that are, I think, particularly around how we really put a large focus on our side on correlation, maybe more, and that's kind of a dirty word from the old sim days, but correlation for this idea of actually providing relevant information. And to Paul's point, like if I can, who cares if it's 10,000 alerts, but if I put them into 6 buckets that are very clearly defined, like here's the 6 things to look at, then that's, I think, useful. And they helped us, I think, provide some really good feedback on making that even more clear and helping to provide that prioritization and also kind of a combination that makes those numerous alerts be more digestible to an analyst.
Did you have any kind of a, no offense, why the hell didn't that work kind of moments when you're looking at this? Or, I don't know, aha moment?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, so definitely, especially looking into the next round of testing as well, there's things that we look at and go, yeah, you know what, we need to expand into that to provide some more focus and clarity here. This one was sort of a magical moment for us where we had already started to sort of release this additional PowerShell eventing that was different than what Microsoft was using, and then they announced, hey, we're using PowerShell. There was some advanced work we implemented for WMI to help with this. One thing that I think was more of like, I wonder if we could have done better is we released a new functionality that allows us to basically adjust API hooking on demand. So instead of writing new kernel-based code, we actually have a sort of a framework now, so we can deliver from our protection systems or protection cloud the ability to sort of add hooks to new APIs. And some of the impetus was like a couple years ago, when atom bombing came out, hooking some new process injection, new API for process injection that wasn't being monitored. And the reaction time to that was time to develop a new kernel, test it, validate it, sign it, as opposed to this new method we have now. We can respond, in hours or hopefully faster with these things. So part of we were wondering, how much of this could we improve if we were actually in a cycle to react to that, right? To have that ability to say, okay, let's from our cloud system actually update that during the evaluation. We obviously they didn't do that for good reason here. Let you modify during, but that was something we definitely want to investigate more of. Is like if we get more visibility into more APIs and have a more dynamic approach to adjustment, does that help with the detections here?
Yeah, I think another factor to keep in mind when there's an evaluation of vendor products is on the evaluator side, what is their skill level, knowledge of the product, and ability to configure it, and then how much collaboration do they have with the vendor? And oftentimes, in the past, having worked for security vendors, sometimes I'm like, well, we would have detected that if you had configured it that way. And it sounds like that largely that conversation happened, Mike. I don't know if you can speak to kind of the knowledge and skill level of these products that the evaluators have, which is not always, but sometimes a point of contention when an evaluation takes place.
Yeah, this is another area where MITRE really, I think, did their research and did a good job, which is it was very collaborative throughout the test. So the way that the test actually is implemented is that they actually have a couple people from our team with them while they evaluate, so that they'll run a test, they'll let us, sort of like look at it as well and say, hey, we saw this, what did you see? And if there's a difference or a problem with that level, like if you look at the steps, those sort of 19 steps and 134 sub steps, imagine this dialogue between each one of like, hey, we just tested this, we saw this, what did you see? So that way they can correct it. They can either correct it on the fly or tell you, hey, we didn't see that, so that means an analyst won't see it either, and actually not give you credit for it. And that was really good for us. It does mean it's an investment of time and commitment for each vendor, but I think it level sets and eliminates that point you said, which is that the analyst, the MITRE team doesn't have to be an expert on every product. They can act like the basic user and then have a conversation on if they should have actually give you credit for something that might be above what they've actually saw themselves.
Yeah, I almost like to see some data, and I don't know if it's in here, from MITRE on and usability is so hard because it's so subjective, right? But if they could somehow objectively measure, like basically this was a lot easier to use and configure than something else, or have some measurement of that. I'm not sure how they would do that, again, objectively, but I think that's a really important point, no?
Yeah, it's hugely important. I mean, I think I would argue that I would rather have a usable product that was had less visibility than one that had phenomenal visibility but sucked at like having an analyst use it. That I had to build my own tooling on top of. I think we've all had those experiences, right? Where you write your own framework on top of a product because you can't use it. They actually had for a while during this round, they had a category they were going to rate, which was called innovation, which was that layer for them to add the qualitative assessment that said, hey, we thought this was pretty cool, like this aspect of the technology. But again, MITRE is very data driven, which is good. And so I think when they got closer to releasing this test results, they looked at that and said, well, we can't really defensively put like, why was this mentioned as innovation and not this on this other product, and decided not to go forward with that. But yeah, we are continuing to talk to them about in this next round, for round 3 and others, like how can we add a layer, like you mentioned, of can I actually use this? The good news is, at least I think they've narrowed the field just at a high level of like who has the visibility I need. They've narrowed the field down so that you as a user can say, okay, well, I don't need to look at these like 21 vendors. I can look at these 6, and then you can get your hands on and actually see it. Part of it is, can you get your hands on, right? So not to go back to plugging Elastic, but sort of our way of being sort of free and open means that you can go and download and try it out, as opposed to having to engage with a sales team and go through this crazy cycle, and maybe you'll get a demo at some point. I think that's part of the help as well, right? Can you actually see if this works in my environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I always wonder as we go forward, and these evaluations in my assessment seem to be getting better and better each time. Is how do we measure like how easy or difficult is it to bypass, right? Like I've always wanted it, so I collect this information from my pen tester friends, right? If I come across a product, like, hey, you guys seen this? And if you did, were you able to bypass it or not? Now, that in of itself isn't like a fantastic data point, because that also leaves the variable of how well did and how much time did the defensive team in that organization put into this product, right? Because I mean, like anything, any product is you get out of what you put into it, right? But some way to measure the ease at which someone could bypass it, right? Because we've all talked to pen testers, we've all read about all these various campaigns and how easy or difficult it was for them to bypass endpoint products. I don't think that's the sole evaluation point, but again, it kind of goes back to risk tolerance. If I'm in a major sensitive area, right, and things are super critical, and I'm really concerned about the ability to bypass, and that's high up on my list, how do I measure that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, and I think one that even if someone were just to take a few of the basic categories and just try to evaluate, like just knowing simply does a service stop shut down the product, like that's a big problem, right?
Right.
I could just run that and have it shut off before you even get into advanced techniques of evasion. And then with that same point, I love that you brought it to risk, because something we'd like to talk about a lot as well is this idea of being able to fully execute the same type of protections in a disconnected fashion. So if it's my executive's laptop and they're on an airplane, or they're for some reason disconnected from the platform is doing analysis, what do I lose? Is all the work done at the platform layer, or is there a layer that's implemented at the on the host itself that means that my risk posture is maybe at 60% or 80% if it's not able to connect back to home base? Because we've seen adversaries do things like DDoS the security system, especially if it's a cloud system, right? Just DDoS that thing, then all of a sudden now you can't do this initial analysis that happens in the cloud. So how does the endpoint by itself perform?
That's interesting. And Mike, where does Elastic fall on that? I believe you do most of the analysis on the endpoint side, correct? And not on the cloud side.
Yeah,
but I imagine that varies per vendor and what version of the software the vendor and configuration perhaps too, right? There's a lot of variables just even in that one data point.
Yeah, it actually becomes a very dicey when you talk to some vendors about it, when you start to peel back the layers of, like, even for basic things like malware prevention, there might be a model that exists on the endpoint that's somewhat viable, and then a better model in the cloud. For us, like you said, like we sort of our roots in the years back, coming from the endgame side, were in the federal space, which is typically disconnected. So we lived in a world where we had to build everything disconnected. So all the logic for us lives on the endpoint layer. Now, with moving in and joining forces with Elastic, we get to take the benefit of also now adding an additional layer of cloud where we can do a lot more cool stuff. But it doesn't mean that that's like, it's the inverse of what a lot of people did, was start SaaS and then try to build down. We have everything already on the endpoint, and now we're just adding additional capabilities in cloud, which I think helps from a risk posture standpoint. But again, it's up to the, there is huge benefits from cloud. So if that isn't a concern for some people and that they accept the risk, then it's something just to consider in their evaluations.
Are there things, and I kind of want to ask like some product management questions, right? Like, are there things you really want to build into the product? And then are there other things where you're like, the endpoint's just not the place to do this? Like, stop asking for that. Like, you know what I mean? Because I know you get a lot of questions and
Yeah.
requests from customers, right? Like, help us think about, like, give your insights on how should we be thinking about the endpoint problem? Where are some of the limitations? And then what should we be demanding of our vendors that it absolutely should be in there that maybe isn't common across a lot of these?
Yeah, one thing that I think coming to Elastic is really where it kind of hit me, and I've been here now for about 8 months. And now that I have a larger purview over the whole security solution, which includes a SIM offering and many of these beats offerings, and beats are sort of these data shifters that collect data for the network side. We have things like packet beat. We have beats that get data off of many different types of systems that might not be your traditional or classical host endpoint, like a laptop or a server. It's really opened my eyes to this idea of everything detection response, and being able to then also correlate information and tell the narrative of not just what happened on the host. I'm still a firm believer that the host is the closer to the attack you can get, the better, because you get high fidelity data, especially if you're down in the kernel. Then you can hopefully not get lied to by the adversary. So host data is, I think, still extremely critical, and it's important. To your point, like what I always talk to people about is the ability, like you mentioned, to evade and either evading the endpoint itself or just lying to it. Changing. If it relies on ETW data for Windows, for example, can I just change that log data and now the endpoint reports that as fact, right? Is there actually an ability to tell me more truth than what is just typically in the OS itself? And the risk factor that you mentioned as well, as far as coverage, there's a critical part that you have to get network for. I mean, you look at things like IoT, you're not going to install an endpoint on an IoT device. It's just physically impossible most of the time. But there's a lot of additional context I can get from that, like who it's talking to. Was it, a lot of header information is really useful in IoT. And now if you have an ability to kind of combine that data together into a single place, into one of these XDR or SIM Plus or Next, whatever you want to call this thing, solution, I think you can have a lot tighter control over security. And so for me, I've been kind of changing my mindset a lot to talk more about security being overall a data problem or a visibility problem. And, host is one layer we really need it, but I look at sort of 4 core layers of host, network, and then cloud and user, evolving sort of these key things I want to tie together to understand, what happened, what did that person do? Like, especially if they're using a SaaS technology. If I save a compromised user, I want to know, what do they access in Salesforce? Do they go to Google Drive? What are these things that I can then tie?
Oh, sorry, Mike, we lost you there at the end. We were talking.
Oh, sorry. Well, hopefully
talking about home networking quality.
Hopefully everything I said was amazing.
No worries. No worries. Yeah, I think it's I've been spending a little more time on the application security front, and the endpoint products seem to be largely very focused on Windows systems, and not so much focused on even some of the infrastructure and/or applications. And so that's a big delineation, right? Attackers may shift. They may, you may not. You may get on an endpoint. You may not. But there's also the application side. That's important. That largely, this set of vendors, as I look at them, is really focused on what we refer to as the endpoint, which is really the user system, right?
Right. Well, especially as we move to, like, many people working from home and a lot of them using SaaS services, where you're not going to get an endpoint installed on that SaaS system you're on, but you could get visibility into API calls, or you could get visibility into sort of the auditing and logging on those systems. Yeah, I think the story becomes much broader. It's more about, again, it's sort of a data problem on where can I just understand what's happening. This executed, the user then did this thing in Salesforce, they then did this thing over here. These, as you mentioned, the application performance monitoring type data being also utilized. Like, we talk a lot on our side because we also have an observability solution. But the way that Elastic works is we don't sort of skew things off by product. We just have a basic resource-based price where you pay for the resources and you get everything you want. So you can actually, if you have an observability user with a lot of that APM data, you can do basic config management. Hey, did somebody touch the, is there a root log on my AWS system that changed the configuration file? All the way into actually analyzing the API calls to look for some kind of malicious intent that might be happening.
Yeah, and I think that's why the endpoint evaluations and choices that enterprises make are so different, right? Because at least the good ones are looking at the problem holistically and making decisions based on their criteria, skill set of their team, risk tolerance, all the things we talked about, and going, here's what I want out of an endpoint product. And then I'm also going to need some kind of endpoint visibility. I'm going to need maybe some kind of threat intelligence that's built into various solutions. And I'm going to need some kind of logging, right, and analysis of my logs. and really kind of balancing across all 4 of those quadrants. I call them my enchanted quadrants, right? And so, like, what do I want out of each one of those quadrants? And I think that balance is very different across organizations for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, that's. I think we looked at that enchanted quadrant a lot. I like that description of things. And you're right that people might over rotate on technology, right? They might have this challenge where they look at, I don't know, the sort of network, and they go over heavily into network,
right?
Or host, and go too heavily into host. And I think that thinking about it holistically, like you just said, what outcome do I want? And then take that quadrant's a great example of look at it and say, well, how do I solve, if I'm worried about just sort of meeting compliance, what do I need here? Well, I need threat intelligence that gives me the most up-to-date compliance measures. I need reporting that gives me, the CIS top 20 or NIST, whatever the framework is I'm using, outcomes. And then just go find the technology that meets those. Instead, what I think happens a lot is we go find technology and then figure out, can we meet the use case with the technology we built?
Yeah, absolutely. More questions for Mike? Comments on the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations?
I have a question.
For me.
Go ahead.
Jeff?
All right, I'll go. I apologize, Mike. I don't remember the exact name, but the last time you were on the show, you were talking about the work you guys were doing with predictive scoring, or prioritizing vulnerabilities to eliminate the 95% that you don't need to worry about. I'm curious as to, did any of that, was it applied to this exercise, and was it a factor in how well you guys scored on that one table where you scored the best? That first table.
I think the last time we talked a lot about I think the dirty word that is automation in the industry, and that I fully believe in automating to help the analyst, but there's no such thing as automating away the analyst. And so what you're discussing is work we've done, and we still, of course, a ways to go, as everyone does, but in kind of automatically gathering all the data and enriching and tagging the data that makes sense around an alert, so that when I get a problem, I don't have to then go and dig into the log system and figure out if this is important to me. Like all that data gathering pieces that an analyst does, it just sucks, right? Instead, just give me the picture and let me then use my expertise in the business and in security to like gauge the risk of this and understand what my next step is. So part of that was definitely measured in the I think the correlation and the telemetry modifiers of what they show, which is really about like how much context do we bring to the individual alert. It's hard to kind of suss out the weight of that versus everything else in comparison to other vendors based on the way they presented the data. That's what we're really hoping for innovation to show that. But yeah, that's a big thing what we're trying to do. And then we've recently done things like adding a risk score as well, not just severity, but adding risk score as well to these alerts to have that ability to kind of use those in concert to provide a more aggregated view. We haven't brought that to a test yet, so that's the next thing we need to see if that helps as well. But yeah, I think that it's a hard job, and Paul mentioned earlier, like you can easily, and I think all of us have examples, even when we were defenders or from customers that we work with, where the problem was sitting there in their console somewhere, right? They just didn't have the time to look at it. It was buried down at number 9,070. So bubbling up this thing of importance is such a critical problem that we're trying to solve.
All right, I have one more silly question, and I'll ask it to anybody. You mentioned risk scoring or risk ranking. Is something like APT 29 and this exercise that MITRE did? I don't know what the exact number was. I think it's in your website somewhere, but some number of dozens or hundreds of attack techniques all fall under APT 29. Is the risk? Maybe let me ask the question this way. Does it make more sense to categorize the risk of each of the attack techniques? Or if you see something that indicates APT 29, that risk sort of cascades to whatever they do? Hopefully that question makes sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. It's like, and this is a constant conversation on our side of what is risk. I think for us right now, the current thinking is that the risk is much more to equate to your impact to your business. We're not a big fan of attribution. I mean, I think attribution is interesting, but I don't know if it's too helpful from if it's a crime or group versus APT 28 or 29, and they're still both going after my credit card data. Like, does it matter to me? So to us, it's the risk is more about the systems being targeted and the users' access that are on those systems. is there been admin logins recently? That means that they could have admin credentials, stored in the environment. Is it a system that's been deemed a critical asset? These types of things I think are for us a way to that. Plus, of course, the amount of activity has been around that help to bring the risk to that more so than I think than the attribution. Although attribution is interesting, right? As a part of threat intelligence, you could help us to pull attribution to that.
Yeah, I think.
I
was just going to say to Mike's
Paul.
point, like attribution is also less interesting to me, more so than how it influences the likelihood score of any particular technique, right? Because once it starts kind of leaking out into the public that there's whoever the group is, they're using this technique, that means that maybe there's an increased likelihood that that technique may be used against my network. And it doesn't matter who it is, right? Now it's just kind of out there in circulation. So to me, that should influence the priority that I have to protect my organization against that if there is an increased likelihood.
Yeah, I think threat intel from people like ISAC groups, I think really helps with that. Getting the specific vertical-based intelligence from a shared group of users that helps to say that, hey, you know what? Like this target is somebody that's a lot like you, which means it probably is targeted at you versus sort of the background noise that happens is really critical.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking so much attribution, but I see how you go there with that. I guess my one comment on attribution would be, there's been quite a few companies that have been breached over the last couple of years that, right or wrong, accurately or inaccurately tried to attribute to, let's say, a nation state rather than any particular APT, sort of trying to get, in my opinion, sort of swaying public opinion to, oh my gosh, how could you, poor little company like you, ever possibly withstand an attack against a nation state? So woe is you, but gosh, what are you going to do? I see how that plays out. I guess I was thinking more along the lines of, if you actually as an organization have the ability to detect something and see that it's APT whatever, I would think that's a DEFCON 5, all hands on deck, let's up our game because somebody specifically is targeting us for whatever reason, rather than all the random crap that you're hit with on a continuous basis. But maybe I'm just being a little bit naive. I don't know.
Well, I guess the point I was trying to make to that end, Jeff, was that when groups out there are targeting specific targets and using specific techniques, that may be some of the first times we might have seen that in the wild. And what happens is those techniques become more commonplace and are used against a more broader set of targets. So I guess my point was the likelihood that technique could be used against you for whatever reason, right? Ends up in common everyday malware that most of us see is increasing once we start seeing that stuff for the first time.
Well, and to Mike's point, that's where the ISACs come in. Hopefully, if they're because you may not be seeing it,
correct?
But if one of your competitive peers is seeing it, that would be good to know.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
It's a challenge with TTPs is it's so hard to attribute just what you said. I mean, you look back at like Eternal Blue, for example, and I mean, used to be an APT, then it got leaked, and then it was in every ransomware sample around.
Yep.
So it's I think it's exactly right. The combination of kind of peer-based threat intel. If you do have good signatures, earlier in the talk you mentioned that Cyber Command just pushed out some more signatures for things they've seen. That does help a lot as well to add that enrichment.
Is there a risk of tunnel vision in all this? Do we see customers looking too narrowly? They're not worried about enough of the more general threats. They think, well, I'm only worried about an APT, or people smart enough not to get that narrow.
No, this is 100% starts to be the shiny object problem where it's APT protection, MITRE, like it's becoming the new buzzword. I mean, there's always something right out there in the space, but yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you still look at the reports. The majority of attacks happen due to misconfiguration or phishing. So what are we doing about those things? So definitely, I hope, and usually in the conversations I have with our users is I try to talk to them at first about their sort of basic cyber hygiene. Make sure that they're covering those. Like before you move into the side of looking for advanced threats, have you covered the basic threats? So you're exactly right. Like, we definitely have a challenge here where you need to know why you're looking at this. You're looking at this because you built a good foundation and you already have control over the sort of the basics that are available. And then the next step is to increase your, sort of pyramid growth of security, where now you go to the advanced level. But yeah, it's a fantastic point.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult for folks to navigate those waters and try and prioritize what they should be defending against, right? You can start by looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and then go, okay, where do I start within that? And there's lots of different data points you can look at to assess that, both internally and looking at external resources such as the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? But I think every organization needs to have their own strategy based on formulas that I think will get better over time. In terms of, prioritizing your remediation and defensive efforts to these specific techniques and techniques that aren't in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? I think that the great thing that's happened in the past year or so is more people are aware of a lot of these more advanced techniques that are, air quotes advanced, because of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So that's definitely upped everyone's game from the vendor side, also to the enterprise defender side as well. But I think there's a trap we can kind of get lost in, which technique, what do I need to defend myself against? What's the highest priority of what I need to defend myself against? It's still difficult to answer. What's basic hygiene is also a great question too.
Yeah, the good news about this is you're exactly right. It brings to the forefront the conversation, especially around visibility. That if you're using sort of legacy AV or something where you're blocking known stuff, but your defenders are sitting there blind to like what actually is happening. This is, I think, a good point to bring to their executive leadership team and say, hey, we need visibility, and you can use some of these buzzwords to scare them, because that's the first step, right? Just give me the data. You give a smart analyst log data, and they'll find something, right? They'll find a way to make that useful. And this, I hope this starts that conversation in the teams that maybe aren't there yet from a visibility or access standpoint.
Fantastic, Mike. Closing thoughts or things for our listeners to look at. Of course, the report, again, which is in our wiki.securityweekly.com. It's episode 651. The link to the dashboard from Elastic of the recent test by MITRE is there.
Is ass long, by the way.
Is what's that?
It's like long, 10,000 characters.
Yes.
We couldn't paste it.
Yeah, there's a shortcut we could give you.
Yeah, if you back up a
we
page,
should give you the shortcut link
I found
that we have.
That would be great.
There's a shorter, there is a shortened URL, and that is in the wiki. So
perfect. Yeah, the shortcut URL is a perfect way to go.
Cool.
But no, closing thoughts wise, I think you brought up a really important word earlier that I always like to talk about when I talk to anybody about security, which as much as we love to go into details and kind of talk tech, like the first layer, just understanding the risk and what does it mean for you to build strong security posture, what risk are you willing to accept is so critical. And what I hope people get out of the segment and out of the dashboard is that you should be demanding full transparency and full openness from your security vendors, because they're partners, right? You're sort of the three ways to deal with risk, right? You're sort of mitigating it through someone else's product line, and in order for you to actually accept that, you need to understand exactly what's happening and it's exactly what they're doing, and not just believe they're collateral. So hopefully, this is the beginning of the conversation that no matter who you pick for security, you force them to have an open conversation and be very transparent about what it is they do. How does the product work? And for reports like this, don't just give me the headline that says we won. Explain to me what that actually means.
Agreed. Mike, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Fantastic. That will conclude this segment. Take a short break. Come back with Harry Sverdlov from Edgewise. Stay tuned.